Okay, good evening. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to just go ahead and remove my mask for a couple of reasons. Number one, because we're on camera. We're going to stream this, so I think people could, with the visual thing, that would work out a little bit better. But I'm Dr. Wellman, principal at Floyd Central, and want to thank you for coming to this. Mental health has been sort of our is become sort of our focus this past year. We did a session on it last year with Ms. Kim Gesford. That was earlier in the year, and of course things have dramatically changed since the last time we've had one of these. And so the shift has really, I guess, actually come from our kids, more or less. We've had a lot of kids question and ask, can we do some things when it comes to mental health? Can we build some awareness? And so if you walk through the school, you'll see some signs up, just some real positive things about that also have to do with Suicide Awareness Month, which I'm aware was September, but with school starting late, we kind of missed the wind up to that. So we're actually going to do a little bit of that through November. Well, starting next week, Mrs. Hudson has T-shirts that she has sold to wear around that has a phone number on it and all of that stuff that she has raised. Like I said, in addition to all sorts of signs around the building. The senior exec has become really interested in that, and that's been one of their things that they wanted to push, is the whole mental health thing. So we think that we're making some progress with just the simple awareness of it. And I think we've seen an uptick. We were already seeing a trend in our school, and that's pretty much reflective nationwide of student anxiety. And we could go into the root cause and all that stuff, and that would be a whole nother session. And people have written books about what causes that, but what we're left with is how we're going to deal with it. It's part of growing up right now. It's part of our society, for better, for worse, I guess. And what are some strategies that we can use to deal with that? So one of those, we won a Lilly grant a few years ago, and we were able to bring in some mental health specialists. Each school has a mental health specialist inside their building, as well as a social worker, and that has helped immensely just to get those kids. That we had a lot of services out there for students, but just a lot of students and parents were not aware of those services, and so that's been great. We have Katie Stein, that is our social worker. She's in the building at least twice a week to help with various social services there, and we also have Hannah Baranal, who is our mental health specialist. She's been with us since last December. Okay, about a year and a half. Well, almost a year. And she carries a full caseload here. That was one of our things that we thought had to happen, because she also works with LifeSpring. We partner with them, and she works with 20, 25 kids on a regular basis, somewhere thereabouts. And has made a lot of progress with these kids. Actually, having it on site is a really big deal. And she's been a good resource for us to go to. She comes into our weekly counselor meetings at FC that we have, and is able to provide feedback on maybe questions that we have when it comes to mental health, advice, and all of that stuff. So we're very, very pleased with the partnership that we have with LifeSpring. So she's going to come up here, and I know we had some people submit some questions. She'll go over those. In addition to just going over some basic strategies of mental health. So welcome, Kim.
Oh, can you guys hear me? Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm going to take my mask off since you're all so far away. Is that okay with everybody? Okay, great. Okay. Thank you all for coming. It's good to see you all here. As Dr. Wellman shared, I'm here to share some things about mental health today, both generally and some of the ways that COVID has really impacted mental health and some of the changes that we've seen, as well as maybe warning signs and things to look for, either in your teenagers or your students. I don't know if any of you are teachers here tonight, but just kind of some things to look for, some coping strategies, and then how to access resources in the community. I am going to address some of the questions that were sent in at the end. Hopefully throughout the presentation I might have already addressed some of those questions, but you all can let me know whether or not those have been sufficiently answered, and then hopefully we'll have time for you guys to ask some more questions as well. Okay. So the name of our talk is Crisis and Counseling in the Time of COVID. So I wanted to turn to one of the definitions of crisis. Most of us, I think, when we think of crisis in a mental health sense, we think maybe about someone being suicidal or having a break with reality or being so depressed they can't get out of bed or something along those lines. But that's not the only definition of crisis. This definition, crisis is a perception or experience of an event or situation as an intolerable difficulty that exceeds the person's current resources and coping mechanisms. I really like this definition for tonight because, what has COVID been if not a crisis just like this? I don't know about all of you, but I certainly was not prepared to handle it, whether it be adjusting to working from home or not being able to see your friends as much or just not being able to go to Target and walk around. I mean, it's been really hard, so I know it's been hard for our teenagers as well. So here are some factors that I think both can kind of contribute to how much the pandemic is impacting people and just kind of some important things to think about. Isolation and lack of physical contact. I'm a hugger, and COVID has really kind of changed that, and that's been a hard thing. I know that a lot of the teenagers I see are huggers, and a lot of them hug their friends as a means of telling them that they love them. It's a love language. It's a way to express your affection, whether it's friends, relationships, or anything like that. There is actually a thing that's called touch deprivation that's been studied, and when we're used to having physical human contact, it can bring down the stress hormone in our bodies. It can also bring down blood pressure and heart rate. So when we all of a sudden don't have that, it can have negative consequences, and it can definitely increase rates of depression and anxiety. Family conflict, if you're having some tension at home, and a lot of times that's because we're all just trying to deal with this, so that comes out at home with the people that you trust. When there's conflict at home and there's nowhere to go, that's going to impact mood and a lot of other things. Lack of routine and normalcy. So I know that when school closed back in March, a lot of the kids that I was still seeing via teletherapy online, they would tell me that they weren't maintaining much of a bedtime anymore. They were staying up a lot later because it was a lot more casual. They would wake up later and, go to school in their pajamas. So understandable. But eventually that lack of routine and normalcy did really start to impact things. So I think at this point, a lot of people have started to kind of redo their routine, especially as the school year have started. But for the people who have struggled to get that back on track, it's been really tough. Anxiety and depression. So some of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of the people who have social anxiety, when things started to shut down, they were really excited. So it was like, okay, now I don't have to worry about all of these social interactions that I have all day long. I don't have to be nervous about them. I can just, like I said, go to class in my pajamas and talk to the 2 or 3 people who I really trust and am comfortable talking to. So the social anxiety went down, depression went up because of all these other factors that we're talking about, especially I think isolation and lack of contact. But then now, as they've returned to school, for the kids who have come back to school in person, for those kids, the social anxiety may have come back worse than it was before. And I'm even seeing social anxiety in some kids who really didn't display any symptoms of that before at all, which is interesting. So one way to think about it, I think, is social anxiety, just like any type of anxiety, needs to be kind of challenged and worked on. And so if they go home and are kind of hiding at home and don't have to deal with it, then that anxiety is not being challenged at all. And so if you go months without challenging it and all of a sudden you have to come back, it's really, really scary. So I've talked to a lot of kids who are worried about their grandparents or the parents or their friends who maybe are diabetic or something. Like, people are genuinely concerned for their own family. So those health concerns, both, I think, where in some families, a lot of families are isolating a lot more than other families because of those specific health concerns. And so if the kids are carrying around the stress of, am I going to get my mom or dad sick, or am I going to get my grandma sick, then that can definitely increase anxiety as well, of course. So some families, of course, struggle with food insecurity and not having access to financial resources. And if it's a kid who is typically able to get their meals at school and now they can't, that's a problem. Or if one of their parents or both have been laid off, which unfortunately has been a huge thing with COVID across all socioeconomic statuses, I find that a lot of the kids are kind of worrying about that and carrying that burden around too. And how could they not? Loss of things to look forward to. I don't know about you guys, but any times in my life when I've ever felt kind of low, like having events that were coming up that I was looking forward to was a huge thing, like a friend's birthday or going on a trip or something like that. And so when the kids, well, when all of us don't have that, it can definitely increase hopelessness and kind of that idea of like, okay, well, what's next? What's happening? Especially because there doesn't appear to be like a definitive end in sight to all this. So missing out on milestone events, I think specifically about the teenagers last year who didn't get to go to graduation. They didn't get to go to prom, and I think for those of us who are a little bit past that stage, we got to experience those things. So we didn't miss like some of those more formative events, but the people who are missing those now, I think that's a really hard thing. And I know a lot of families have done a really good job of really acknowledging that and making sure their kid feels seen, and like they'll have a little graduation event or something like that, which is great. But not all families are able to or just do that stuff. And so it's definitely a form of loss and grief that our kids are experiencing. So here's some statistics about mental health generally, and this is just for the state of Indiana. So about 10% of kids studied take medications for emotional, behavioral, or concentration issues. And a lot of Indiana falls, unfortunately, within a shortage area, more than 50%. And so what that means is that there aren't enough providers to meet the needs of the kids that need the resources, which is really unfortunate. And my guess would be that that is one of the main reasons why Indiana's averages seem to be higher than the national averages with mental health indicators. As you see down here, there are higher averages of depression and anxiety in Indiana. A full third of high school students reported feeling sad or hopeless in the past year that study came out, that's a pretty high number, and that might be a little bit surprising. In 2015, 1 in 5 high school students had seriously contemplated suicide within that year, and girls are twice as likely as boys to attempt suicide. So this data isn't to scare you guys or to be alarmist in any way, but rather to point out the prevalence of this. Because I think if you don't necessarily have any reason to know about mental health or talk about mental health, it doesn't seem like it's as big of a thing as it really is. And also, this data was taken well before the pandemic started. So if you kind of take into account how things are now, I can only imagine that the data itself will have been driven up quite a bit. So when we're considering teenagers and how mental health impacts them, we want to pay attention to special cultural factors and different segments of the population as well. So for LGBTQ teens, they are 5 times more likely to have attempted suicide than their heterosexual or straight counterparts. The good news is this can be mitigated for. So this study that was done in 2018 showed that if an LGBTQ teen has at least one supporting and caring adult, they are significantly less likely to attempt suicide. And that's great news, because we can do something about that. We can control that. So that could be a parent who listens unconditionally. It could be a teacher that they really trust. It could be a counselor. It could be an aunt or uncle who they've always thought is really cool and they go get ice cream with and talk about everything. It doesn't necessarily matter who it is. And of course, the more supportive adults, the better. But this is something for all of us to remember, I think, because whether or not your teen falls within this category, you definitely know some teens who do. And mental health generally, you're going to know some kids who are struggling. So the more we know generally about mental health, the more we can kind of help support our teens just as a whole and as a community. Pronouns are prevention. I want to point this out because if any of you know kids who have come out as trans, often they will say that, they would like to be addressed by a different pronoun than they were previously, whereas someone might have gone by she or her before. Now they want to go by he or him or they or them. I've definitely overheard, just stories about where sometimes the response to that is, oh, it's just a phase, or that's silly, we're not going to call you anything different than what we named you. But I want to emphasize how important it is. It's been studied recently that using the correct pronouns that a teen prefers is actually suicide prevention. Because it's validating. It makes them feel seen and heard, and that you care about what their needs are, and I think that's the most important thing there. So for teens of color, another subset of the population to consider, there are, and many of you all may know this, there are health disparities and also COVID disparities within segments of the population that aren't white. Definitely for Black families, Latino families, the rates of COVID have been higher, and the long-term health outcomes have been worse. So if you're a teenager in a family who has been impacted more, or who you're worried about getting sicker or dying or having more long-term consequences, of course that's going to drive up stress and anxiety as well. Treatment access. Treatment is not always accessible in communities of color, and it definitely depends on where you live. That may be more of a significant thing over in Louisville, right across the river, but definitely treatment is not always as accessible. Hispanic teens are actually more likely to report feeling sad or helpless than any other group of teens. And I actually found this resource that I thought was pretty cool. There's this new text line. It's a crisis line, and I'll talk about it again later, where kids can text 741-741, and it was, the idea of it was that they wouldn't have to talk on the phone, because none of the teenagers I know like to talk on the phone. I don't know if you guys as teens do or not. But so they can text and they can get special help. But if they text the keyword Steve, if they're a teen of color, they can make sure to connect with someone who really uniquely understands what they're going through, and I thought that was pretty cool. So there's a lot of misconceptions about mental health, about suicide, about treatment, about all these things. And one of the ones I hear a lot is that people are afraid that if they directly ask their child or someone if they're suicidal, that it might put the idea in their head if it wasn't there already. I've heard this a lot. I actually didn't learn that wasn't true until graduate school. But it isn't true. Research does show that it's really important that you ask those questions and that you ask them directly. So it can be uncomfortable. And sometimes it's tempting to kind of beat around the bush a little bit, or say something along the lines of, you're not thinking about hurting yourself, are you? Or you wouldn't do something stupid like that, would you? I've heard kind of questions along those lines before, but it's really important to just say, hey, I've noticed you've really been struggling. Are you thinking about killing yourself? It's really important to just kind of speak that out into the open. And the times that I have done that with kids, they always appreciate it. They always, and sometimes they'll admit it and sometimes they won't. But I think opening that door is a really important thing, because then they feel free to talk about it. Of course, there's a treatment stigma. It's 2020, but there's still that idea sometimes that if you go to counseling or therapy, that something's wrong with you, you're crazy, or something like that. I've heard kids say that. They've come to me and said, I want to talk to somebody, but I don't want people to think there's something wrong with me. So I think that the more we raise awareness about mental health and the normalcy and how healthy it is to get treatment, and how it can be really healthy to be proactive about it rather than wait until something's gone really, really wrong, I think the better off we'll all be as a community. So feeling like a failure if your teenager comes to you and says, hey, I'm really depressed. I've heard, a lot of parents in the past have felt like, well, did I do something wrong? Is it my fault? No, it's not your fault. There's so many factors that go into anxiety and depression and mental illness. And as Dr. Wellman said, that would be a whole nother talk, because that's so many things. But it's not an indication of who you are as a parent, and it's not an indication of who your kid is either. And I try to tell the kids that I work with that it's such a huge strength to reach out for help. It's really brave, and it's a really hard thing to do. So I just try to really reinforce that with them. There's definitely the idea that mental health concerns might only impact certain communities, or if you don't struggle financially, that maybe there's nothing to be worried about, or just kind of other things like that I've heard throughout my work as a social worker. And I just think it's important to note that it impacts everyone, and it doesn't really discriminate. So some of you in the questions asked about changes to look for in your kids. And a lot of these, I want to emphasize that we are looking at changes. So if your kid just kind of never eats breakfast and always has a bad appetite, for example, that's just, that's not necessarily a concern, right? Because it's their baseline. So if your kid all of a sudden, and I keep saying your kid, but it could be your student, your teacher, whomever. But if they're all of a sudden very irritable and snapping at you, where it used to be that communication was really easy, that's something to look out for. Frequent tearfulness, or just seeming really overwhelmed, especially if it seems like something small to you and you're like, why are you breaking down? Like, what's going on? That's something to look for. Staying in their room, but again, more than they normally do. I know a lot of teenagers just prefer to stay in the room. So if they're doing that a lot more and you're really just not seeing them at all, If you're not hearing them talk about their friends anymore, if they just all of a sudden stop talking about people, that could, definitely be an indication that they're either on purpose isolating from their friends, or they're not feeling enough energy to talk to people, or maybe even that they've had some sort of a fight with their friends and something's going on. Again, changes in appetite. If all of a sudden you don't see your kid come down for meals ever, if they're losing weight, if you notice that they've gained a bunch of weight and that they're eating all the time, that might be something to look out for as well. Flat affect, so that basically just means there's nothing there, like there's no expression of excitement or sadness or anything, or even anger. It's just flat. It's just nothing, and they weren't like that before. Not doing things they used to enjoy. They used to like going out for a hike, and despite the fact that you can still do that with COVID, they're not doing it. That's, something to look for. Changes in communication, like I said, if they're snappy, if they used to always talk to you at the dinner table and now they won't talk at all. Changes in sleep. And some of that could just be their routine being thrown off, which is kind of different. But if your kids, you notice they're staying up all night, and they're sleeping all day, or they can't drag themselves out of bed, those are things to look for. So some other considerations, adult support. So do the adults in the home have their own social support? That's really important. So if the other family members have friends that they can turn to and talk to, then they're not necessarily relying on the teenager to kind of be the social support. And sometimes, I mean, that does happen pretty often. And sometimes when it does, that can kind of impact maybe a little bit of pressure on the teenager as well. Caregiving or financial strain. I know I already mentioned before, like the way that finances have impacted people. So if kids are worried about that, if maybe kids are doing a lot of caregiving for their younger siblings, which is completely understandable, because if people are trying to work from home, you can't necessarily do that while caring for 3 other kids, or just caregiving things that are also going to impact your kids' stress levels. So these are just some very basic coping skills that I wanted to just kind of share with you all and talk about briefly. Of course, there are hundreds more. It's really any healthy activity you can do to either kind of distract yourself or just help yourself get through whatever the distress is. So I talk to my kids a lot about grounding techniques. There's one exercise called the 5 senses exercise, and it's really great if you're starting to feel very anxious or panicky or out of control. So you take the 5 senses and you line them up with the numbers 1 through 5. And if your kid is starting to panic, you might say to them, tell me 5 things you can see. Tell me 4 things you can hear. 3 things you can touch. 2 things you can, I've lost track now, smell. And 1 thing you can taste. So it really, at first they're going to roll their eyes at you and be like, okay. But it draws them into the moment, and the point is to get their mind off of whatever that acute anxiety is. So it doesn't really matter what the activity is. It's anything that grounds them into the moment. That also can be helpful if any of you know kids who have post-traumatic stress disorder. That can be really helpful if they're having a flashback or something else along those lines. So of course, deep breathing is always helpful. Exercise and routine are huge things as well, because of, with exercising, it releases endorphins. Getting outside, vitamin D, that's a good thing. Journaling can be helpful either for processing feelings or for distracting yourself. Sometimes I tell my kids to set a timer if they're in some type of acute distress, like say they're having thoughts about hurting themselves. I'll sometimes advocate that they set a timer for 15 minutes and do something else for 15 minutes. And then at the end of the 15 minutes, the idea is that the immediate danger may have passed. The feeling behind it and the situation may not be gone, but that immediate need to do something impulsive that teenagers get, it may have already passed. Doing something distracting, that can be anything. That can be going for a walk. That can be watching a funny movie. Doesn't really matter what it is. Going outside, anything that uses creative skills, writing a letter, making up a song, really anything. Meditation and yoga are also helpful. So some of the other questions that were submitted asked, like, do you have any tips for kind of how to handle? If your kid comes to you and says, hey, I've been thinking about hurting myself, or hey, I'm really struggling, I can't focus at school, or I can't get out of bed in the morning, and you've never heard them talk about any of this before, it can be really alarming and really throw you off, understandably. But I think it's important, if you can, to try not to overreact. And the reason for this is that if your kid comes to you and says this and you get understandably upset and you start to cry or you yell at them or something, it can make them internalize the message that, oh, I shouldn't have said anything. I upset my parent, or I upset my teacher, or I upset my counselor, so I just won't say anything from now on. So if you can try to regulate and then, go in your bedroom and close the door and scream into the pillow later, then that would be probably preferable. Always validate your kids' emotions. So, especially with the pandemic, I think it's okay to say, you know what, this really kind of sucks. This is not fun for any of us, and it's okay that you're feeling as bad as you're feeling. Like, just to say that and make sure that they know that it's normal and okay. Avoiding comparisons. I know sometimes it's easy to say, oh, you think you're stressed, but I had this, and this at work today, and I'm under this deadline, and all you have is homework. But if you can avoid that, I think trying to, because again, that sort of goes in with the validation piece. So I try to encourage people to treat depression and anxiety like you would any other illness, diabetes, asthma, cancer, because after all, the brain is also an organ. So it's important that we take care of that organ as well. If a kid needed insulin to manage diabetes, no one would hesitate, right? So the idea that we've got to take care of their brain just as much. I mentioned this before, but just kind of making sure there are things to look forward to, especially if things were to get worse and, we were to go back to having to be more at home all the time. Just trying to find things that are, even if it's like, okay, on Sunday nights we order pizza and we watch a stupid movie. Or maybe on Wednesday nights we play a board game, or every other Sunday we go walk in a park. Whatever it is, then they know, okay, I have this coming up. This is good. So I wanted to mention media here, both because teenagers are on social media so much, but also because of what's being portrayed in the media right now, both with COVID going on. There's a ton of stuff going on politically. No matter which side of the spectrum you fall on there's just so much going on, and it's really stressful for everyone. So I think it's important not to ignore that. It's important to talk to your kids about what's going on, but then also try to make sure they're not consuming that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and doing what we call doom scrolling, which is where, like, you can't stop looking at it. You can just keep scrolling and scrolling and looking at it and consuming it, and it really impacts us. Remember that you might be your main source of your kids' everything, especially if you have kids who are all virtual. They may not talk to another human being in person, aside from their parents. They might not get a hug from anybody else. And so if, the parent is able to go out into the world and go to work and interact with people, it may be hard to come home and remember that your kid maybe didn't interact with anybody else all day. So just try to keep that in mind. Consider your own treatment and self-care. I think modeling is huge. So if a kid sees their parent prioritizing their own mental health by, I don't know, having a friend that they vent with, or going to yoga, or taking a walk, or even having a counselor, then they, I think, are more likely to feel like, oh, okay, this is okay and normal, this is fine. And the more that the adults or anybody else in the house can regulate, the more the teenagers are able to regulate as well. So finding help, again, validate. Thank your kids for trusting you, for telling you what's going on, because that's a huge thing. And if you can make a plan, whether it be for safety or for treatment, and you can make the plan with them rather than for them, I think that would be so great, because they're getting to the age where they're going to have to start making their own decisions anyway. And so if they can kind of buy into whatever the plan is, I think that can be a lot more effective. Of course, it's different if there's a safety issue and they aren't willing to get help. That's different. Just ask them what they need. A lot of times people say, how do I help my kid? What do they need? And I think most of the time they can tell you. Sometimes they can't, because sometimes they're overwhelmed and they're not sure, but sometimes maybe they just need someone to listen, and maybe they'll be able to say that. You can always call your insurance company and find out what providers are covered. That can sometimes be a quick way to find some counseling. There's a bunch of local agencies. I've got a slide about it, and there's also out on the table in the lobby, there's a whole list of community resources that you can access. You can always reach out to your school, your counselors, your administrators, me. You can always just reach out, and we can try to help direct you in the direction that you might need to go, even if it's not us specifically. If there's an emergency, many of you may know this, but if a kid were ever to express the desire to kill themselves and say something along the lines of having a plan to do that, it would be important to get them to a hospital right away. That can be Wellstone in Jeffersonville. Many of you may know where that is. It can be Clark Memorial to the emergency room. It doesn't necessarily matter initially where it is. They will kind of try to help you get to the right place. So these are just some different types of therapy because in the mental health world, we kind of just throw around terms a lot and assume that people know what they mean. So I'm going to try to not do that. So IOP stands for intensive outpatient, and if you think about the hierarchy of mental health treatment, at the top there would be inpatient, where someone would be hospitalized. Under that would be intensive outpatient, which would mean that they might go to a counseling group maybe 5 days a week for 3 hours a day or something like that as kind of a step down. Outpatient is where it's the next level, where it's just where you traditionally like go to an office to see someone. And then school-based is the level below that, and that's what I do here in the school. So that is both a little bit more convenient because they can just come downstairs, and you don't have to drive them to an appointment, but it also doesn't necessarily meet really intense clinical needs. Those are more served by outpatient settings. So here are some resources. LifeSpring is my company that I work for. Wellstone is the local hospital, and Alliance is a provider that works with them and does medication provisions and things like that. ACP, Associates in Counseling and Psychotherapy, they also provide therapy, and they now provide medication management as well. And this text line again, this 741-741. We've also got little flyers out front on the table about this too. I would encourage you guys to take one. The Trevor Project is specifically hotline support for LGBTQ kids that are struggling. Here's the National Suicide Hotline, and this is the SAMHSA Crisis Helpline, and this, I believe you can actually call them and ask them where you can get treatment, if I'm not mistaken. Any good resource or hotline or agency that you call, if they can't help you, they're going to help you find someone who will also. The National Suicide Hotline, there was actually a law passed that's going to allow it to become a 3-digit number, and I think it doesn't take place until July of 22 or something like that, but it'll be actually, one of my kids was reminding me about this today, and I was like, thank you for reminding me. I think the number is going to be 828 or something like super easy to remember, so that's great. So I'm going to just look at some of the questions that you all submitted, and then if you have additional questions, of course I want you to ask me. See if I can pull this up here. So one of the main things was things to be on the lookout for in your kids. Was that question answered sufficiently? Yeah? Okay. So someone here submitted talking about how difficult it is to be the role of parent, employee, teacher, all these things from home, getting frustrated with kids when they don't have motivation and it's hard to keep them on track with school. That's valid. How can we tell if this is building up inside of our teens and how it may be affecting their short and long-term mental health if they aren't verbally sharing their feelings? I think just mostly some of those warning signs we talked about, whether it be behavioral communication changes, eating changes, body language changes, things like that are usually some pretty good indications. I think it would be rare that your kid wouldn't display any signs of any of that. This one's asking about a student who sometimes feels physically ill before going to in-person school as an uptick in anxiety, and asking how to help him manage his anxiety on school days. So I want to go back to the whole challenging anxiety thing. So encouraging your kids that if they're struggling and they're like, this is really scary, I don't want to go to school, I think it's important to, both be supportive and comforting, but also still encourage them to go to school. Because if you can kind of help them find some coping skills that can just help them get through the day, then each day that they're successfully at school, it's going to feel a little bit easier. And then it won't become this thing where months from now they haven't left the house and they don't know how to. Some concerns people talked about: social isolation, too much time on social media, not enough with real people. I think, yeah, that's a huge thing. I think even if you can encourage your kids to, maybe they could go to a park and take a walk with their friends, but a few feet apart with masks on. I mean, maybe there's still ways that they can see each other, and I think it's really important to do that sometimes. This one asks about students with ADHD who struggle with inferiority and comparing themselves to others and the ability of their peers. The virtual version of education is less engaging than classroom instruction, and it keeps them kind of less motivated to stay in the zone. I'm hearing about a lot of that. I'm imagining that's really hard to manage as a parent from home. I think that is where getting creative with kind of how you engage with them in their schoolwork. Maybe they're not great at making a schedule for themselves. Maybe you need to sit down with them and help them fill out a calendar and do that. Maybe it's sitting down together once a week and looking at assignments and grades and how they're going. Maybe it's asking your kid, like, hey, I need you to tell me what you learned in calculus today. So that maybe that's a little extra incentive for them to kind of pay attention and take notes. Adjusting to A/B scheduling with being up early some mornings and other mornings not. I think if it's possible to kind of encourage them to get up around the same time every day, they're going to hate that. But I think it'll really help. It'll really help a lot. This one mentions that a lot of places offer teletherapy. When are those good and when are they maybe not enough? I think it depends on the kid. I've had a lot of teenagers who actually really prefer teletherapy. They're more comfortable because they're like sitting on their bed in their pajama pants and they just feel relaxed and they don't feel any pressure. But some kids are really uncomfortable talking on camera. So I think it kind of just depends on what their preference is, really. And a lot of companies offer both teletherapy and in person, depending on what they need. With struggling to get your student to engage and participate in counseling, I do think sometimes they may just not be in a place where they're ready to seek treatment, and that can be a big factor, because if you kind of force a kid to go to counseling, sometimes it ends up turning into a good thing. Like sometimes it ends up being okay, but sometimes if they're not going to engage, like if they aren't ready to engage, it's just not really going to be therapeutic for them. But also with engagement, sometimes the dynamic between the counselor and the kid just doesn't work out, and maybe it's needing to find someone else, or ask them like, hey, what do you struggle with this counselor? Is it that you prefer to see a male counselor? Is it something that the counselor is giving off that makes you feel uncomfortable? And so kind of figuring that out, and maybe either addressing it with the counselor or even finding a different provider is always an option too. Those are the ones that had been submitted. Do you guys have any more questions or feedback? Nothing? No, really? Okay. Okay.
I wrote down a couple of notes that I think are important for you guys to have. When we have a student that makes a threat against themselves, says they're going to hurt themselves, we have a protocol that we have to go through. We used to, and when I say that, this was within the last couple of years. There wasn't much when the student came back to school. So, for example, if a student did have some mental health issues, had to go out of school for a while, we didn't really have any sort of way to bring them back. I mean, we allowed them to come back, obviously, when there was a signed statement that says that they're safe to return to school. But now we have an intake program. So we have a program where they say, hey, what sort of supports are you going to need, that type of thing. So we have a person that is now in charge of that, and so that's been really good. For some kids, the being at home is not a good thing. We understand that, and so we're working diligently to try to open the school up to more kids. Although we have had sort of an influx of kids, or an outflux, one of the two, to go for kids to go virtual, to go back to virtual. We had a big rush for kids that wanted to go virtual at the beginning of the year. We've had some kids come back because of maybe failing grades or it just isn't working out. And now we've had some kids still request to go to virtual because of the uptick in cases in this area. But then again, I've got kids, they're passing each other on the highway. I mean, going back in and out. So we have fall athletes wanting to come back, and we have some kids wanting to go back to virtual. So we are trying to get as many kids that have grade trouble in the school as possible. And we put a little note on the report card, which will be coming home within the next day or two. They got put in the mail today, to try to get those kids that have failing grades back in the building 4 days a week. Now with that, we are going to try to get as many kids as we can safely get in the building and still adhere or still have the advantages of the hybrid schedule. correct? So it wouldn't be very good if I had, still be on the hybrid schedule and have, 1,500 kids in the building every day. So we're very careful of that. And I know we have a lot of kids out there that are being successful with it, but still want to come back. Or maybe they'll say they're AB kids and they're making a C and they want to get back in school to up their grades. And I'm sensitive to that. I'm going to be very sensitive to that and get them back in as quickly as I can. But it won't be at least until the end of next week where we start strategizing how we're going to actually do that. And then also I think that whole thing about validation is very important. Okay, very important. I think before I started educating myself on that and reading things, I think I would have probably said, to a kid, hey, just cheer up. It's a big deal, just and not validate what they said. And you really not only help the student out by doing that, you really help yourself out because you sort of open yourself up to a whole new way of thinking and sharing that suffering that the kid does. I know that sounds kind of morbid, the sharing the suffering, but what greater gift to give to somebody. And then also, I'd like to thank two groups here tonight. I'd like to thank WNAS, Mr. Shaw and his group for being here, for coming out this evening. Also, I'd like to thank PTO. Can we get a close-up on Ms. Schindler back there? Okay, is that possible? Okay, PTO president. Fantastic. Okay, great. She's a PTO president. We really love their support, and it was their idea to kind of do something like that. So I'll be curious to see how many people tuned in on the streaming thing. At the very least, we'll push this out. I think it's been very, very helpful with the information that she's given. There are a lot of things in there that I didn't know, or maybe it reaffirmed what I already knew. Does anybody have any questions? Any more? Maybe you thought of something for Hannah or me. Okay. Well, great. Thanks again for coming. Enjoy your evening.